This is Law and Disorder.
Today on Law and Disorder, we'll talk about David Gilbert's new book, Love and Struggle.
This extraordinary book by a man who is currently serving a 75-year-to-life sentence teaches us all lessons of the past and lessons that will help with the future.
In a disturbing revelation, we'll hear how the U.S. government actually used Guatemalans as test subjects.
Most of us have heard of Tuskegee and the experimenting on African Americans with syphilis. Here's one you probably don't know. It was done by some of the same people in Guatemala.
Stay with us.
I'm New York City attorney and author Michael Smith.
I'm Heidi Bogosian, Executive Director of the National Lawyers Guild.
And I'm Michael Ratner, President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights.
Case shocks the conscience. Tests were conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service on more than 5,000 individuals in Guatemala. From 1946 to at least 1953, over 1,000 people were deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases. The victims included inmates, soldiers, the mentally ill, and commercial sex workers, none of whom had consented or knew about the experimentations on their bodies. It's important to note that the experimentation in Guatemala was overseen by the same laboratory, the Public Health Service's Venereal Disease Research Laboratory, as the STD experiments at Tuskegee. In fact, some of the same researchers were involved, as were some of the same diseases. In the Tuskegee case, the parties reached a $10 million settlement in 1974, in which the U.S. promised to provide medical benefits to the participants and established the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program. Meanwhile, a class action lawsuit has been filed on behalf of 8 individuals who claim to have been victims in the Guatemalan case, spouses or descendants of victims, and is now winding its way through federal courts. We're joined by Piper Hendricks, an attorney working on the Guatemalan case. She has served as the International Justice Project Director of the World Organization for Human Rights USA in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Piper, to Law and Disorder.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've heard about the atrocities that the U.S. government perpetrated on thousands of individuals in Guatemala in the late 40s to early 50s. Can you give us a brief overview of what happened?
What happened is that the experiments began in 1946, and we have to remember that this is a time around the end of World War II when a lot of soldiers were coming back with syphilis and other venereal diseases, and the medical authorities in the United States wanted to find a way to treat this because a lot of our soldiers were ending up out of commission. And so there were experiments that were begun in the United States, and some advances were made, but what they really wanted to do was find out how to treat syphilis right after exposure. But in order to do that, you needed to find a way to expose people to it and have people who were there and thus better subjects for the immediate application of some sort of treatment. And so there were experiments going on in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I think we're all familiar with many that were going on in Tuskegee, Alabama. But there were ethical limitations of what the researchers could do in the United States, which, as an aside, obviously many of those were violated in Tuskegee, Alabama. But wanting to have a more vulnerable population and get away with things that would not be acceptable here in the United States, the U.S. medical researchers went down to Guatemala and targeted vulnerable populations there, including orphans, mental health patients, prisoners, soldiers, and people who never gave consent personally to be part of these experiments.
Piper, how did they expose these individuals?
They used a number of different methods. There were things like bringing spinal fluid out of the spinal column, mixing that with syphilitic material, and injecting it back into the person.
So this would be, for example, when the person was in the hospital, how did they get them in there to start with?
Well, the populations that they were working with were all in various institutions already. You had mental health patients in the mental health institution. You have orphans who are already in the orphanage. You have soldiers who are under the command of the commanding officers, and people who are already there, for lack of a better word, captive. And so the experiments took place in those institutions where people were already institutionalized. And they used different methods such as mixing, really quite disturbing, mixing material from genitalia into water and having people drink it, really disturbing things, scrapes and into different regions of the body and directly introducing pus and other infections there.
Ooh. When was this discovered? When did this come to light?
It all came to light very recently, just in October of 2010. Professor Susan Reverby up at Wellesley College was looking at some of the materials from Tuskegee, Alabama, and realized that what she was seeing was not just from Alabama, but also from Guatemala. So it all came to light in that fall of 2010, and when it did, President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and Secretary Sebelius all promptly apologized to the Guatemalan people and to the world, acknowledging that what had happened was particularly egregious and unethical and illegal.
I have a question for you. This is 46 to 53 in Guatemala. Is that about right?
It's about right. Yeah, there's no indication of when exactly it ended, but the records indicate it lasted at least until 1953.
And the Tuskegee experiment, which is again most of us know about it as a complete atrocity. But what period was that? Around the same time?
It started around the same time, a bit earlier, and lasted until around the 70s. So it went longer. And what's interesting about Tuskegee is when it first began, it wasn't as unethical as when it ended, in the sense that there wasn't a known treatment for syphilis at the time. And so they brought in people who were already infected and wanted to watch the course of the disease. What does it do to the human body left untreated? But then when penicillin became a known remedy for syphilis, the fact that it was withheld and that people were very, very intentionally misled about what was going on made that particularly egregious in Alabama.
Just remind us, who was involved in the Tuskegee experiment? Who were the people they were looking at, the group?
The test subjects there were about 600 African-American men, all living in the area of Alabama, and the experimenters were part of the United States Public Health Service. A lot of overlap with the team there and the team in Guatemala. Dr. Cutler was one who was involved in both places.
What was the discussion in terms of the criteria of picking non-white people to be victimized? They went to Tuskegee, Alabama. They went down to Guatemala, which is a lot of indigenous people. Was there any kind of conscious discussion about the racism involved in this?
There was, actually, both at the time and, obviously in hindsight, people have noted that there's absolutely a racial element to both experiments. I think in Tuskegee you have a population that's not as well protected at the time, definitely not respected. This is all pre-civil rights movement, and really a vulnerable population. In Guatemala, it was acknowledged in some of the correspondence between the U.S. researchers that there were things that they could not get away with in the United States, but they could in Guatemala, because people were not looking out for the interests of the populations there, and because they were just seeing, some of the comments are particularly disturbing, indicating that people who were of certain descent wouldn't understand the procedures, and so therefore there was no obligation to explain things to them or try to get their consent, which is just, it's disgusting. That as a researcher, it's your obligation to put whatever you're doing in terms that someone can understand, and to put the blame on the people who were victimized is really disturbing.
Now, Piper, what you've just said so clearly violates all medical ethics, the pledges that doctors take. Tell us the grounds for the lawsuit that is now pending. Does it involve any of that violation on behalf of practitioners?
It does. We've brought several claims, some under international law and then some as constitutional violations. And the international law claims look at specifically the non-consensual human medical experimentation, and then also bring a claim for cruel and human degrading treatment. And that's something that the statute that we're proceeding under, the Alien Tort Statute, is one that you can't use in U.S. court unless you clear the hurdle of having a violation of international law. It has to be something that's so egregious that the entire world essentially agrees that this is something that is wrong and should not be done. And that's where, with the non-consensual human medical experimentation, we only need to look at Nuremberg and see that's a perfect example of the entire world coming out and saying this is something we do not accept. And as you alluded to, this is something that's part of the Hippocratic Oath. The medical profession has known this for centuries. There's just never a question that you should not be intentionally infecting people and causing such harm.
Piper, who are the plaintiffs and who are the defendants?
Yeah, I was going to ask that too. How do you defend it? How do you defend a case like this?
The plaintiffs that we're representing are the people who were individually involved in the experiments and their family members. And given that the nature of the diseases that were involved, this is something that you pass on to your spouse and potentially to your children. And so that's something that we're now representing the individual survivors and their heirs as well. The defendants in this case are the U.S. government and the Pan American Health Organization, which is the subsequent organization from the Pan American Sanitary Health Bureau. So the PASB is what existed in the 1940s, and that's now transformed into PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization.
And what are their defenses? Statute of limitations, procedural stuff? How can they substantially defend against this?
Oh, that's a good question. If you look at the defenses, it's almost like a Lincoln Logs, the way everything sort of fits together just right so that you can't reach the government the way they're arguing things. First of all, they're arguing that they should be substituted under the Westfall Act for any individual defendants. And so on the theory that these defendants, the individual doctors, were acting within the scope of employment. And that from the very get-go. I mean, there's a big question mark there. Can you say that intentionally infecting people with venereal diseases really truly was within the scope of employment? And we naturally argue it was not. But then when you substitute the U.S. government, you're then proceeding under the Federal Tort Claims Act. And in some, you can only sue the U.S. government when the U.S. government gives you permission to do so. So it's like the fox guarding the hen house here.
This is what happens for 10 years at the Center for Constitutional Rights. It's the exact same issue. You sue the individuals. They claim it's within the scope of employment, whether it's torture or whatever else. They substitute the federal government. And then there's all kinds of immunities about the federal government outside the country, et cetera, et cetera. So I assume that's the same issue, right?
Yeah, and it's pretty remarkable. I mean, you look at in one context, they're saying, well, we can't reach them because all of the decisions were made in the United States, looking at the law of the District of Columbia. But then not a few paragraphs later, you say, well, you can't reach us because all this conduct took place in a foreign country. So there's a lot of selectivity in when you're looking at what conduct and what laws. And I think at the end of the day, when you take a step back and say, really, are we going to say that our government is immune for violating this portion of international law? And we think that the answer is absolutely not.
Let me go back. Where are you, in the district court, the lowest court?
We are. Right now we're proceeding in the federal court in the District of Columbia.
And has there been an argument on this yet?
Not yet. We filed the case in March of 2010 and then told it for a while. The Presidential Commission for Bioethics was looking at all the evidence that was available. And what's interesting in this case is that Dr. Cutler kept pretty extensive records. And so even though it happened decades ago, we have a good starting point on understanding what happened.
Before you go there, I want to go there, but I want to get a sense. There was a settlement in the Tuskegee case.
There was.
A settlement or a congressional award, I don't remember which, but because in some way I think the legal obstacles, I mean, you may get through them, but I know having litigated many of these cases, they're not the easiest ones in the world. They're good to put pressure on and maybe win, but is there any efforts in Congress to sort of match the Tuskegee settlement for people in Guatemala, or is that just not there yet?
We've been talking to people on the Hill and encouraging a response to this as soon as possible. I mean, given the passage of time, we're dealing with very old populations and people who have actually passed away since the filing of the case, which is really sad to think that people would find out that they've been wronged in this way and then die never seeing justice. Unfortunately, as we all know, there's a lot of issues going on right now on the Hill, and we're in an election year. And so far, we haven't had any sort of concrete response at this time.
I have a question about the year it ended, 1953. Arbenz, who was the democratically elected president of Guatemala, took office, I think, around that time, right at 1953. He's overthrown by the United States in 1954. Mm-hmm. Was the fact that there was a democratically elected government anything to do with the ultimate stopping of this experiment in Guatemala?
I think that there are a number of factors as to why it ended. And again, we're not entirely clear exactly when it ended. We just have records that cut off at that point, but there's no indication that they affirmatively packed up shop and went home. I think that there were starting to be questions here in the United States. The people who had been overseeing the experiment were leaving their posts, and so it just became a little too risky to keep going there. And so once Dr. Cutler left, that's when a lot of the records cut off. But I think, as you're saying, that the change in the administration in Guatemala, more questions being asked in the United States, just a number of things made it not as viable as it had been previously.
Piper, especially since Dr. Cutler kept such good records, are there any plans to write a book about this?
I wouldn't be surprised. This has gotten a lot of attention, not as some domestically, but very much internationally. And there's a lot of people who have been going down and meeting with people in Guatemala. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't spoken to anybody who has definite plans to write a book, but it definitely would be one that would be interesting to have the whole story together.
Now, I note that your background includes serving as the International Justice Project Director of the World Organization for Human Rights USA, and you manage the civil case of Charles Taylor Jr. Yes. Can you tell us briefly about that? Winning a spectacular $22 million in damages for 5 torture victims.
Well, that was a really exciting case. I mean, as you may know, that the criminal case against him was the first of its kind, brought under the U.S. version of the Convention Against Torture. And that was an exciting day to see the United States bringing that case against someone who had done such egregious things in Liberia and who, many people aren't aware, is a U.S. citizen. So that was really amazing to see him put away then for 97 years. The difference, though, between a criminal case and a civil case, criminal penalizes the person who committed all the wrongs, but the civil case is what we sought to then have a remedy for the people who were wronged. And we represented 5 Liberians in that case. We brought it as a class action. Unfortunately, it was not certified as such. But then won the judgment against him, again, under the Alien Tort Statute, which is it was a powerful case, both in the end result and then also bringing the plaintiffs in to face the person who had done this. As you might know, the Liberian Civil War is one of the most violent in history. And so to have the ending where, that there's a bit of justice there was really rewarding.
Very impressive. And let's just ask this question. How do we know that our government right now is not continuing to test human subjects?
I don't know that we know that for certain. And that's one thing that's so important about this case is realizing this is not something that's just in the past. If we look now at the experiments that are taking place in Africa, for example, some involving governments, some involving only private entities or private corporations working with governments, it's not clear that we have the level of consent that we should on all fronts. And by now, you'd think that we would have, so many years after World War II, we'd have a little bit more clarity on this issue. Following the Tuskegee experiments, there was another review and a review of our laws to try to ensure that we protected human subjects, but it's not clear that we're quite there yet.
If you prevail in this case, is this setting any kind of precedent?
I would hope so. I mean, as Michael mentioned, that the government is prone to assert immunity whenever it's available. And that's understandable in a way if you look at the very, the line level attorney in DOJ. When you're representing your client, even if your client is the United States government, you assert whatever defenses are available. But I think what this administration, any future administration needs to do is take a step back and say, wait a minute, is this the type of case where we want to be asserting immunity, even if the law might be an arguable defense, but it's just when you look at it in the greater context of international law and human rights, these are actions that are indefensible. So it's our hope that a win in this case would be, a step in the right direction for future administrations not to get to this point. I mean, we initially approached the government suggesting that we could settle this out of court before, without having to file a case at all. Unfortunately, we got no response, and so did file it. But it's something that's unfortunate that we've had to go on, nearly a year and a half now after things have come to light without any sort of remedy for the people who were involved.
Piper Hendricks, it's been a pleasure to have you on. You're doing fabulous work, and we hope to stay in touch with you.
Great to talk to you, Piper.
Thank you, Piper.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you want to hear Law and Disorder again, go to lawanddisorder.org on the web. You should also go to Law and Disorder Radio on Facebook.